Have you ever wondered what your dreams mean? Join us in Dream School at thisjungianlife.com and find out. Jung wrote, "Dreams are a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul."
Dream School is a unique, self-paced online program you can start at any time that unlocks access to your inner world. Our 12-month program provides the support, knowledge, and guidance you need to reach within, decipher your personal dream code, and harness it to optimize your life. By enrolling, you'll join an affirming community of fellow travelers, each pursuing a unique quest.
And it's fun. Join us on an adventure to wholeness and healing through understanding your dreams. Go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Dream School. You'll be taken to our secure checkout. Once you join, you'll get immediate access to our first 3 modules. You can get started right away. We look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Hey everybody, today we have a special treat. Lisa and I are joined by Dr. Bret Alderman, who is the author of Symptom Symbol and the Other of Language. He is also a life coach, and he can be found at aldermancoaching.com. And for those of you that might be concerned, Deb is taking a bit of a vacation, having a lot of fun with her family who are visiting. So, Bret, Lisa and I have been plucking through your book about postmodernism and language, and really harvesting Jung's insight as a kind of restorative medicament for this separation of language from meaning. So I'd love to hear you talk about, where did the idea of this book come from?
If I trace it back far enough, God, I could get into early childhood, to be honest, but I won't. Well, okay. Since you say that, I had to go to speech therapy when I was a little kid. I inverted my B's and my D's and my P's and my Q's. I had to go to remedial reading. I had a lot of issues with language. Later on, when I learned Spanish as a young adult, it took me forever. So on a real personal level, there's questions of just difficulty with language. And I remember being a little kid and sometimes trying to talk to my mother or my father and having just the big knot in my throat and not being able to speak. But if I don't go quite so far back, I would go back to my days as a student at the Evergreen State College, and there were a set of thinkers, namely people like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida and Richard Rorty, who always said things that really didn't set well with me, and a lot of my friends were into these thinkers. I couldn't quite put a finger on it, but I didn't agree with what they're saying, and it really rubbed me the wrong way. And I think I didn't let that annoyance go, and I just sort of followed it, and I started researching and reading. And then by the time I got to the Pacifica Graduate Institute, I was in a class with Aaron Kipnis, and he said, "You know that Joseph Campbell adage to follow your bliss?" And he said, "Well, think about that in terms of writing and replace bliss with any strong emotion. Just anywhere you have a really strong emotion, follow that to write." And I thought, damn, these guys really annoy the hell out of me. I'm going to write about them. And so that's what I did.
And I have a question to ask you. Had you read much of Foucault or Derrida at that point, or were you just sort of peripherally familiar with them?
I had to read a little bit. I mean, we read Foucault in class, and a little bit about Derrida, and I had also read Heidegger and Richard Rorty. And then before going back to Pacifica, I was rereading them. I was kind of going back to them because I was even in fact trying to write a novel around these ideas, but found that it just wasn't quite the right genre to address them. So yeah, I have been.
We share this, Bret, that when I was at university a long time ago, these ideas were very, very popular. And I want to say they were kind of cool. Like, like all of my friends were like, ooh, Derrida, Foucault. And to be perfectly honest, I read a little bit and I just found them like kind of impenetrable. And I don't know that I really got it, but like you, I was like, there's something not right. There's something that doesn't sit well about this for me. And I think in a way, I want to say, just on an aesthetic level, they're not beautiful ideas. They're kind of ugly ideas. Well, at least that was my reaction to it, my very naive reaction to it. But I'm not as, I didn't do the spade work that you have done of really digging into these texts and seeking to understand them on their own terms and evaluating what's useful about them. I mean, you've obviously really immersed yourself. But, before going any further, can we sort of define terms? I mean, these thinkers that you've mentioned would we consider them to be postmodernists? I mean, can we locate them and can you tell us kind of what are the main ideas, essentially?
So the three people that I've mentioned so far, Derrida, Foucault, and Richard Rorty, I think most people would consider them postmodern, and all three of them would probably reject the term. So that's important to keep in mind. And I think as far as characterizing them, they all focused a great deal on language and how it really constructs our sense of the world. I think construct is a real important word to keep in mind. Previous thinkers talked about language as sort of reflecting the world, accurately or inaccurately. So the typical idea is that you say something and that sort of it presents again something that you've perceived or sensed. And these thinkers all in their own way kind of say, well, no, that's actually not what's going on. The language is the primary thing. And then anything that you think you're perceiving comes after the fact. So they sort of flip things on their head from a certain perspective and say, everything's about language, and that's primary, and what might be called perception or phenomena or something like that, that's sort of secondary. So there's this really strong emphasis on language, and with that emphasis, there's sort of a de-emphasis on things like nature or any sense of there being something innate, inherent, or intrinsic to people. Because the idea is that, no, actually it's just this sort of construct that we overlie on top of what we understand humans to be. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
No. So I think it does. So this is a really radical idea, in fact, that there's almost kind of is no immediacy to reality, that it's all kind of constructed through language. And I think you even talk in the book about this idea that humans are a construct, right? Am I remembering that correctly?
So Michel Foucault has an image, I forget in which book of his, where he talks about man, and I'm using his word just because that's, to be accurate, is sort of a construct within a larger, what he says is an episteme, but he means in a larger language system. So he gives this sort of image of like human beings almost being the result of a language system, as opposed to the other way around, which is kind of how we think of it. People come up with words and language and, we use them. It's not as if we're just a result of a language. So it's kind of a really interesting inversion of how most people would think of that relationship.
So when an individual integrates this kind of inversion, what are the symptoms of that in the psyche? What does that give rise to?
What a great question.
Well, I don't want to say that I know, but my sense is that it really gives rise to what Jung would call a rootless consciousness. And, Jung often spoke of a sort of consciousness when he was speaking of his kind of critiquing modern human beings. And he used this image of rootlessness and consciousness that was without foundation, a consciousness that lost any sort of connection with nature. I think that these ideas that we're talking about in many ways reflect and perpetuate that same sort of consciousness. I have a beautiful quote from Jung. Actually, I have thousands, but one that seems particularly relevant to your question, Joseph. I'm wondering if it would not be a good moment to read it.
Sure.
It says, "This rupture of the link with the unconscious and our submission to the tyranny of words have one great disadvantage. The conscious mind becomes more and more the victim of its own discriminating activity. The picture we have of the world gets broken down into countless particulars, and the original feeling of a unity, which we integrally connected with the unity of the unconscious psyche, is lost. This feeling of unity, in the form of the correspondence theory and the sympathy of all things, dominated philosophy until well into the 17th century." I think that's where we're at. In an exaggerated, almost that, a little bit on steroids, so to speak.
Well, and I'm not a philosopher, so I'm going to tread gently here. But as you were reading that quote, and as you've been talking, I've been thinking about Descartes and his assertion that I think, therefore I am, which seems like it's the same kind of process. It's like I'm not here because I'm corporeally present, or I feel things in my body, or I'm having emotions or sensations. It's getting kind of trapped in this very disconnected, decontextualized.
Yes.
And to me, I just think about a kind of Hall of Mirrors effect.
Yes.
It is unsettling, these ideas. I find they make me feel a little, it's a little vertiginous in a kind of bad way. I feel like I'm losing ground to think about it in that sense.
That makes sense to me. Vertiginous, so I get the image of, somebody who's well above the earth and fears falling. And that makes sense because the view of language in particular that a lot of these authors put forth is really language disconnected from the earth, language sort of floating up above the earth and above the body. There's without getting too deep into the woods of the theory here, there's a sense in which language isn't connected to perception. So it's not connected to emotion. They're all just, words are constructs, and how these constructs relate to anything we would call reality is really put into question.
So I'm wondering if there is a contemporary example that comes to mind of language that is no longer connected to reality.
There is, and I want to tread on this really lightly, but it does seem like one of the best examples of how I see this thinking playing itself out. Anytime a person says, "That's just a construct," I hear echoes of the people that I'm talking about. Now, I know there's lots of different ways that you can use that phrase. It's just a construct. But lately I've been hearing that even biological sex and the distinction male-female, that's just a construct. And as soon as I hear that, I hear the fundamental disconnect. Because I think that that sense of biological sex, regardless of what we think about gender and a lot of the discussion that's playing out in that regard, that seems like a pretty bedrock distinction that I think most of us actually can sense and perceive and experience. And when people are saying, well, no, that's actually not even that. That's just sort of some words that we've used to distinguish between people, but there's no fundamental distinction there. That's when I see a good example of that sort of the idea playing itself out in the contemporary field right now.
I think that's true, and I agree with that. And it's one of the reasons why, these ideas, which seem so arcane and difficult to comprehend, and, I'm thinking back to when I was an undergraduate and what's really going on here. And it's sort of like, who cares? These are just ideas that are floating around the classroom. But I do wonder if there's a way that they've seeped through the culture, in a sense.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there must have been a receptivity there to these ideas, which I think speaks to where we are as a collective and our relationship with embodiment and with instinct.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But these ideas, I think, have taken hold and are influencing us, and we don't even know that that's what we're calling upon.
Yeah. I think you're right. And I don't know exactly in what way you are. I mean, it's just when you study something for years, I think it's sort of humbling. So I just want to keep saying, I don't know, I'm not sure. But, from my perspective, in part, I think a lot of these ideas have been so resonant with people because there is sort of a deficit in our modernist scientific worldview that it can be really reductive, and it doesn't really answer the question of meaning. That's also, I think, why Jung continues to be so popular and is gaining in popularity. As he says, well, okay, we've got all this wonderful science and technology, and what does life mean? And I think that a lot of the postmodernists are really speaking to a need in human beings that says, well, wait a second, maybe this is all just, maybe this is really just a narrative that people are talking about. And, they critique a particular reductive scientific worldview that I think really resonates with a lot of people, including myself.
Yeah. There's definitely, and it's definitely true that language influences how we think, right? I think,
yeah. One of the reasons that I really framed my book the way I did in terms of symptom and symbol is that I didn't want to do a really reductive reading where I just, beat these philosophers over the head with my own personal grudges. So when I was thinking of, them being as symptomatic and symbolic of something, to me, that means, well, there's a lot there, and I'm never going to be able to say everything. And there's going to be something of value in what they have to say. And one of the things that's of value is that they do force us to think, well, wait a second. To what extent is that idea just a product of my culture, the particular moment in history in which I'm living? And, to what extent are the words I use really, they're just words after all. They're not absolute truths, So they do really bring attention to a lot of important themes.
So what's constellating in me, Bret, there's just a lot, of course, moving around right now.
Yeah.
Is I'm just back to this idea that language, or the belief that language constructs the world, reality, and what we were just talking about is that language can even construct biology. And so I'm just sitting with that, and I'm imagining, just as a psychic phenomena, as a collective psychic phenomena, that the ego has laid claim to this world of logos, where the word created the world, God as the word. And that when the ego arrogates that power that the word of the ego can construct or reconstruct all things. And this even shows up with this idea of alternative facts that showed up in the political sphere, that words are not even tethered remotely to anything real. And yet human beings will absorb them, identify with them, find them actionable even. So if we were to think of that process of untethering words from reality, what is that a symptom of? I mean, it's a neurosis in as much as it's a split.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what we're diagnosing the culture with.
I keep coming back to the word dissociation, a split from our sensate selves, our experiential bodies, not our bodies as objects or as images, but the bodies that we're seeing through and living through right now. Even right now, as we speak, we're looking at each other on these screens. And this is becoming a typical experience where we see others as images, but we don't touch them. We're not in the same room with other people. There's sort of this primary dissociation that's taking place by virtue of the technology that we're using. So we're really becoming more and more split off from our own bodies and sort of enamored of representations. And that can be words in books, and it can be images on screens. So I keep coming back to the word dissociation. On that note, the word deconstruction, which is a very postmodernist sort of word, etymologically shares the same root with the word dissociation. The dis of dissociation and the D of deconstruction are just two variations of the same Latin, Greco-Latin root. So that's something I keep coming back to, primary dissociation.
Lifting that up a little bit, I want to read just a few sentences actually from your book.
Yeah.
You open the first chapter with this image of Andreas Vesalius, who was, I suppose, the first person in kind of since antiquity to dissect a body. Is that right? So
Yeah.
You say, before this incision upon a female breast, dead bodies were not dissected, but commemorated, not demembered, but remembered. But with Vesalius, a scalpel cuts into human ligament and bone, tendon and cartilage, fibrous tissue and blood vessel, and with every carving motion of his incisive blade, the bodies of the deceased acquire a different meaning. Cadavers as objects of study no longer bear any relation to the souls of the departed. The corpse is invented, whereas before dead human bodies memorialized these souls, and the living related with empathy and respect to the stilled bodies of the dead, refraining, even criminalizing incisions made upon them. With Vesalius, the dead become inert material to be displayed and dissected, mapped and measured. And where I'm going with this, and the reason I want to bring it up is because talking about this dissociation, you're pointing to this moment in time, 1543, when there's this shift in how we view the body. And it's a shift away from integrative, holistic, lived experience, which sees the body as sacred, into a scientific mindset. And of course, we say, thank God, because, with Vesalius, this is an important step in the development of modern medicine, for which we are all grateful. But the scientific mindset does have a way of dissociating us from the embodied experience. And then I'm wondering if, with the sudden advent of this technology and these screens and all of these images of bodies everywhere all the time, if that's not another step removed from.
Yeah. The shift that took place with Vesalius, I think is, like you say, it's incredibly important, and thank God, thank God for modern medicine and this ability for us to kind of see ourselves as these anatomical objects and these machines, so to speak. But I think the issue is that we've kind of taken that image and it's with us, and we think of ourselves as that, as those objects. And we lose not just sight, but we lose the feeling, the touch, the taste, and the smell, and the sense, the deep, visceral sense that we're not just bodies, we're somebodies, and which is to say that we're animate bodies. Anima, of course, being ensouled bodies.
I'm thinking about this process of beginning with a whole, splitting into parts, and then returning to a whole.
Exactly.
Just that birth, death, and resurrection cycle.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about Neumann's model, where everything comes out of the primal unity of the Great Mother, and that ego differentiates from that and has to fight its way from out of this unconscious union with all things in order to develop a discrete quality of consciousness. I'm wondering if this post-modern claiming of language is in service to another level of differentiation, which may be required on a cultural level. And I think what you're saying is not that that's so much a bad thing, so to speak, but you are sensing the movement of the arc from that towards a need for a return to unity.
Yeah. The image that I use in the book and just in my thinking is that of an astronaut. And I think that a lot of these ideas that we've been discussing, metaphorically speaking, are a bit like an astronaut looking at the Earth from space. What a wonderful way of being able to look at the Earth that gives us a completely different perspective than if we're standing here on the ground and, being nourished by her biosphere. And so I think whether or not some of these ideas end up serving us or are kind of the final nails in our coffins, so, they indicate our demise, is whether or not how we embrace them. If we're those astronauts looking at the Earth, are we going to come back to the Earth? Or are we going to just go off into space and thinking that we can be utterly independent of the Earth and of nature? This is another reason why I wanted to think in terms of symptom and symbol, because from my perspective, something that is symptomatic is simultaneously it indicates something's not going well right here. There's something kind of pathological. There's something that's hurt and not really fundamentally fully conducive to human well-being, and at the same time there's some sort of a healthy impulse. So I think there is a healthy impulse, and there is this potentially really, really valuable thing in being able to focus on our language and seeing how we are constructing our realities and seeing how things that we thought were just innate and inherent and intrinsic to the human condition maybe aren't, or they were really appropriate ways to be seeing these things in the past, but now we're in a new situation. And so I think you're right on target, Joseph. What you're describing, I thought about a little bit as, individuation as a work against nature. Obra contra naturam, I think, is how Jung describes it. And we have to pass through that. But if we get stuck there, we're in trouble.
So what we could imagine is, in this enormous world of billions of people, that we're all in different levels of development. For some people, working hard to still differentiate from the world of instinct and cultural assumptions and inherited complexes. And for those people, fighting to even become aware of language and thought and how that contributes to themselves and society. And your book is a kind of beacon to people who feel that they are called to this return to unity, to synthesis.
Yeah.
And I think this is what Jung talked about in terms of the emergence of the self, which does not happen to everyone. That for some of us, ego building is the task of, could be the entire life or the task of a culture. But for those who are called to resynthesize and come back to this symbol of unity, which Jung called the self, that we have to abandon the seduction of deconstruction, the seduction and the hubris that the ego can magically reformulate the world in its own imagination, and allow ourselves to be confronted by the immutable.
Right. Wow. That you said that so well. I think you're right on target. For me, another way of thinking about it is I think of, deconstruction as being perhaps a very necessary moment in a larger process, where we do need to kind of step back and say, these are just cultural ideas, cultural constructs. This is just language. I don't have to abide by this. And it's also, I think, I mean this in a better sense of the word, sort of a puerile, sort of youthful attitude in which you say, well, wait a second, I don't have to buy into all these cultural constructs. I don't have to. This is just things that people have came up with. And that's a real important thing to be able to do. But you do need to at some point say, well, why did they come up with them? And are they valid? And oh, gosh, some of them are. Some of these cultural constructs are really referring to things that are just sort of bedrock and that I do have to come to terms with in a more fundamental way. But I actually like it the way you put it even better, Joseph.
Well, right. I mean, Joseph, I'm appreciating that too, that the ego has to come to terms with that which is immutable. The ego is not omnipotent, and that there are, rocks upon which we can throw ourselves that, no matter how hard we try, it's just, there it is. I'm thinking back to the discussion about, sex as a social construct, which is something that I have heard repeated. And I know it's being taught in schools, for example. What came up for me just in reverie during that part of the conversation was this incredible documentary from 2010 with Werner Herzog called The Cave of Forgotten Dreams. And it's this beautiful documentary about the Chauvet caves in France, with these very, very ancient drawings of animals. And the sense of the film does a really good job of conveying this sense of sacredness of being in these caves, which they're closed to the public. You can't go in. So if you want to see them, you have to watch this documentary. And again, just how very, very ancient these drawings are and how immediate it feels to be in the presence of them. So it is like you are connecting with the psyches of these humans who lived, hundreds of thousands of years ago. And to assert from our vantage point now that there's no such thing as biological sex or that that's merely a construct is so absurd in light of the long history of our species and all of our mammalian relatives. And it is to lose the unity with those who have gone before us and other animals. It really is to set ourselves apart in some way. And that really doesn't make sense, which brings up for me something about both ideas like sex as a social construct and some of Foucault's ideas, which granted, I know most of them only secondhand, but like this idea that man is, just part of a larger episteme or however you put it. These ideas at face value seem kind of silly. Why have they gained so much traction?
The same ideas that seem really silly from one perspective seem incredibly daring and revolutionary from another perspective. And I think with, someone like Foucault, in many ways a brilliant scholar who in many ways actually was a fine writer. A bit, I know that some people might disagree with me, but stylistically, I think he had a lot more to offer than someone like Derrida. But he's, I think it speaks to a sort of archetypal impulse in us that says, you know what? We can, in fact, completely differentiate ourselves from nature. We can completely transcend what was given to us in the past. It's that egoic,
Okay.
I shall define myself. It's back to that Promethean quest, which is exactly what I thought of when you said the word rock, and I immediately thought of Prometheus there chained to the rock.
This I think is a good place to go there. So let's talk about Prometheus and how he fits into your thinking. I know you write about him a lot in the book, and it does seem like the right archetypal image to describe this impulse. So say more about that.
Joseph just earlier was talking about, the ego's desire to differentiate itself, and how that's a necessary process. And Jung quite often talks about the ego in terms of the Promethean myth. And this is exactly, what the ego does is it tries to disempower the gods and to, kind of transcend nature and say, look, the gods are not who's in charge here. I am.
Maybe we should tell the story of Prometheus.
Prometheus stole fire from the gods, and he gave fire to humanity. And because he gave fire to humanity, humans were able to form culture and civilization, and all of technology basically comes from this initial theft that was really going against Zeus's law, against the law of the Olympians. And so he's kind of been considered the patron saint of humanity in a sense. The reading, I think, that Jung gives of it feels very accurate to me in terms of, the ego wanting to take power away from archetypal forces and say, this is mine. But I think what's interesting is that Prometheus, although he's successful in his theft, and humans do become very empowered by virtue of the theft, he also suffers incredibly for it. So his punishment is to be chained to the rocks of the Caucasus Mountains. And he suffers there for several thousand years as an eagle eats out his liver.
Repeatedly, every single day.
Yes. And I think that image, it really does sort of indicate where we're at right now. We're being faced with the fact that we really are chained to the earth. We really do have to realize what is bedrock, what is just what we can't deconstruct, what is the fundamental relationship to the planet Earth that is not going to be something that we can dismiss as just being cultural, just being, an artifact. There's something so fundamental here that we're being asked to recognize in our relationship to the earth and ourselves as animals.
Right. And to our bodies.
To our bodies.
Yeah. I just want to kind of go back to this idea about the scientific viewpoint being kind of the beginnings of this separation that now seems to have, kind of multiplied and extended itself beyond just the scientific standpoint. But there's a way that we can see Jung's whole opus as, in some sense, talking back to science. I mean, I think, over 100 years ago, when Jung was, writing the Red Book, he spoke very clearly about science and the way that it separates us from an integrated sense of ourselves. And I think in some way, again, his whole body of work is meant to try to restore that and do exactly what you were talking about, Joseph, which is, because he also claimed the title of scientist. He thought of himself as a scientist, but I think Joseph, you traced the arc that you go to that place. You go to that astronautic point where you can stand outside and you can see the body as cadaver, or you can see, language from outside the system to the extent possible, and be curious about it and not take anything as a given. And then you come back and you restore and you reconnect and you find a new, more individuated sense of wholeness.
Right. So there's an ego-self access instead of an ego-self merger.
Yes.
At the end of it, ideally. If I think about this some more, and I'm questioning like what stage civilization is in now, I'm drawn also to alchemy, the whole idea of solve et coagula, dissolving and recoagulating, dissolving and recoagulating. So if we perhaps imagine the world that Foucault and the other theorists were trying to deconstruct, to dissolve, ostensibly to create a kind of fluidity, a kind of openness. And then what we might be seeing now are the experiments with coagulation. And out of that kind of solution of words floating without meaning, archetypes, physical forms, and ideas no longer being organized in the way that we're accustomed to, we're then seeing a coagulating process as people experiment with how they might try to retether ideas and forms, and that there is a natural feedback process as to whether or not that can survive. So, for instance, I was just thinking about Da Vinci's flying machines. I don't know why it seemed like a good example. So in this great fluidic creativity, this genius then tries to tether ideas and forms and theorizes these kinds of flying machines, and then discovers they in fact cannot function, that they cannot incarnate. They really need to remain in this imaginal, fantastical world, because when they are subjected to the immutable facts of nature, they can't move forward. We think about this even with the hybridization of seeds. We have this idea we can take two different kinds of seeds and put them together, and this, interesting thing will happen, and then the plant dies, or it can't be fruitful. So I wonder if we're in this stage of the fantastical trying to experiment with congealing, and then nature itself confronts whether or not that is sustainable. And the suffering of watching people and systems come up against the facts of the world and falling apart or being unable to thrive, then brings up that healing response in people like yourself, trying to show a way so that people don't have to continue suffering these failed attempts at coagulating.
I think that's the moment we're in, and I think we're really butting up against those walls where, we're seeing that, okay, some of our flying machines, they don't fly. They sound great in theory and they work in theory, but when you put them into practice, okay, there are some things that just, they don't seem to work here. There's a lot of ideological wars between, kind of science and the humanities. And the humanities want to say, look at, things, we can kind of construct ourselves any way we want, and all the previous constructs they're really just, they're part of it. They're prejudicial and they're part of a historical inheritance, but we don't have to answer to those ideas. And then science keeps saying, well, but wait a second, we're coming up against some hardcore truths or some ideas that we've just tested so often that we know that they're true. And there's a lot of battles going on there, and I keep trying to think of ways that we can kind of say both and, how,
Mm-hmm.
in what ways can something be a construct, but not be just a construct? In what ways can certain things be true in a sort of universal sense, and at the same time, can we pull back and say, but the way that we're putting that into language has everything to do with who we are and what we're
Yeah.
about at this moment, and kind of that both and.
Yeah,
How do
yeah.
we do that? How do we recognize that some of our machines just don't fly, but then go back and design a new machine, and maybe this new one works,
So I think that's really interesting, and I think we're moving something toward what Joseph will sometimes call the mixing of the levels. So that we can talk about things in terms of actual, immediate, factual reality, and that would be this bedrock that we've been discussing of that science purports to find, and I think we can agree that it's pretty good at finding it, whether it's the gravitational constant, or that the Earth revolves around the sun, or some of these things. And there's another level too. There's another level to talking about all of this that is metaphoric or symbolic, or maybe more imaginative. And that we could hold both and recognize that one is not the other, and that when we're in the realm of the symbolic, metaphoric, or imaginal, we have to be careful not to concretize it or collapse it, but allow it to live in that realm.
Yes. There's that famous encounter between Marie-Louise von Franz when she was a young woman and Jung. And they were talking about a patient, and the patient claimed to live on the moon. And Jung said, "Well, yeah, she lives on the moon."
Right.
And Marie-Louise von Franz was like, "No, Jung, you old fart, you don't. She can't live on the moon. I mean, that's an impossibility." And Jung was insistent, like, "No, she lives on the moon." And I probably wouldn't phrase it the way Jung does, but I think he was speaking to a reality that is left out by, a lot of what science has to tell us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why someone like Jung, and I think the field of phenomenology in general, which is another field of philosophy, that really focuses on experience as being important and primary. I think that continues to be so important. There's a whole aspect of human experience that gets left out of a lot of the scientific project, and we have to, especially as Jungians, keep coming back to that and saying, wait a second, there are these metaphoric truths, and there are these experiences that don't fit into what a biologist can tell us, or what a neuroscientist can tell us, and they're real in some sense.
And so we could translate that principle into some of these discussions that are informed by postmodern thought, and say, well, so the bedrock is that there are, males and females, and that's true throughout mammals and many other plants and animals.
Yeah.
But there is a way that the way we think about male and female is very much socially constructed and deserves to be interrogated.
Sure. Yeah. Literally speaking, I'm a man. Metaphorically speaking, yeah, not so much,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if we look at all the connotations that those words have as opposed to their denotations, then it's a whole other ball game. And I think that is something of what's trying to express itself in a lot of our debates on gender. And I think that's, one area in which I probably side somewhat reluctantly with kind of the more postmodern leftist deconstructionists of the gender binary. There's something there that's true, that is trying to express itself. We can't just dismiss it by saying, no, it's as simple as male-female.
Well, and of course, Jung was getting at this in his discussion of the anima and the animus.
Yeah.
He intuited this and was reaching for that idea, I think.
And looking at the symbolism of the hermaphrodite in alchemical thought, and just, I've had dreams of hermaphrodites, and I don't even know if that's the politically correct term at the moment, but beings that are both male and female, and that has been a way for me to acknowledge that I'm fundamentally androgynous in some way, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, as we all are.
Yes.
Whether or not we own that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still circling around this idea of the incarnation of archetypes and Jung's idea of the complex, which you mentioned in your book. So I'm thinking about these universals which press upon humans and human culture, and maybe even press upon nature. And as human beings encounter these organizing structures, they can clothe them in ideas and claim that that is the sole product of the archetype. And you're advocating that that is an insufficient incarnation, that the ideas also have to be clothed in sensations and feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm sitting in this imaginal world within myself and thinking of beings that are solely clothed in ideas and beings that are clothed in ideas, flesh, and feeling, and thinking about the tension between those two ways of imagining an archetype existing in the culture and the effects that that might have. I'm thinking that this refers a little bit to Jung's ideas around Gnosticism and the role of thought in the creation of the universe, and that the movement from thought to embodiment involves a kind of universal pressure. So if an archetypal level is trapped in thought and never permitted to incarnate, that it would create a kind of cultural frustration.
Because it's going to seek expression one way or another, and we're going to consciously or unconsciously be sensing that trappedness. We're going to be picking up on the ways in which people might be saying one thing and emitting or embodying something that's utterly divorced from that. And we're all picking up on this. As you were speaking, I was thinking of the idea of light and dark. Now, from a certain perspective, you could read like a literary text and see where the author uses metaphors of light and metaphors of dark. And then you could say, well, the author is privileging light over darkness, and, there's a certain trope in this certain literature that they're always doing this, and you could associate it to a particular school of thought, and and that all has its place. But you can also look out your window and notice how the light makes you look at trees differently. You could feel the light on your skin and notice how warm it can make you feel. And you could start to sense how the play of light really has a different effect on you than if you were looking out your window and it was dark out. And these are just sort of primary experiences that aren't identical from one person to another, but there's enough similarities there where we can start to talk about some kind of the reality of the archetypal nature of light and dark.
There's a universality to it.
There's a universality to it. And, deconstruction and postmodernism might be bringing us back to the idea of, okay, well, that universality is expressed a little bit differently from one culture, one moment to another, and there's a lot more to it, but let's not lose sight, I would say, of that primary experience of light and dark, warmth and coldness, these sort of sensate feeling responses.
And I think that where that just took us, this idea about accepting the archetypal nature of certain experience, or the universal that underpins this, the importance of that in being able to make meaning. Meaning making is so central. And Jung felt that it was the primary thing, really, for psychological health, that we all need to have a sense of meaning, and particularly in the face of suffering. And I loved this quote that you use. It's not your language, but you use it in your book. It's our technologized and economized society does not encourage the creation of cultural frameworks for bearing pain and suffering, only for avoiding and trying to kill it. We do need frameworks for bearing and making meaning out of suffering. And the universal is one of the ways that we do that.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're cut off from the primacy of experiencing, when we're not allowed to see or acknowledge that which is universal, then we're left alone with our suffering in this kind of hall of mirrors state within our own minds. And I think it does lean into a very pathological place, or it can.
Yeah, that brings me back to the Jung's quote before, when he talks about the sympathy of all things.
Mm-hmm.
When you suffer deeply, you do need to be able to tap into this, how much of a universal experience that is.
That's right.
Suffering is about as universal an experience as there is, and it's not just universal in the sense of, just about everyone except perhaps, some sociopaths suffer. Other animals suffer. This
Mm-hmm.
is a real embracing of grief and loss and pain.
And the immutable.
And the immutable really can, if done with heart, open you up to the whole living planet that we're on.
Mm-hmm.
And if you lose sight of any universal or any sympathy of things, then you're not. Then it's a hall of mirrors, and it's
you're just stuck inside your own head, really, with
Yeah.
kind of nothing means anything. That's part of where these ideas take us eventually.
Mhm.
Is there is no meaning. I mean, in some sense, and maybe I'm overstating it, and stop me if I am, but I think it's really kind of nihilistic.
Well, it's a critique that just comes up over and over and over again of these ideas. You're not the only one who's seeing it. And it makes sense to me, because nihilism is not just the idea that nothing has meaning, but there's no innate, inherent, or intrinsic
Mm-hmm.
meaning.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what postmodernism and deconstruction takes aim at, is this idea of innate, inherent, intrinsic, natural, pre-existing, given in the nature of things, all of that.
Mm-hmm.
What you were saying made me think of, and I know it's been mentioned many times on this podcast, just the idea of legitimate suffering and illegitimate suffering.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And for me, that's
one
sort
of our
of
memes.
Yeah. Nihilism, I think, kind of speaks to that. It's not that there's a lot of suffering there, but it's not given meaning, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not useful. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's not conducive to greater vitality and wholeness. One of the things that I ask, and I was asking while I was writing the book and reading these thinkers, is what is their intellect in service of? Because sometimes brilliant thinkers can put their intellect in service of their pathology rather than a move towards wholeness. And that's the important distinction for me. That's what I'm looking for in an intellectual, is what is his intellect in service of?
Yeah, I think that returns me to some basic kind of Kabbalistic mysticism, that when the ego is functioning exclusively from its sensory appreciation and from its own kind of hall of mirrors, it can still create structures and forms, but they're not connected to the descending life through them.
That's great.
And in that way, there is an alienation even in the midst of creation. Mm-hmm. When human beings develop that upward connection, that something from the self descends into the individual unconscious as a nascent image that rises up to consciousness, to meet consciousness through introspection. And as it rises, it's experienced subjectively as a compelling interest, a desire, something clothed in the anima allure, which is how Jung described the drive of the alchemists. And I think in your writing, it has something to do with the restoration of the validity of instincts. Mm-hmm. Something that is not conscious presses and demands. And when the ego is in service to that level of depth, both in us and above us spiritually, that it answers the question of what are you in service to?
I think any lover of Jung can really sense this in his work, the way in which he would just, wake up and look at a dream that he had and then, spend the next 5 years researching the image and working it through, and just really the sense in which he would just almost receive assignments from the psyche and let himself be lost and explore all those avenues, not knowing where they would take him, not knowing why he was doing it.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the places we are right now is considering the power of ideas. And Jung let himself be led by these ideas that pressed up, and they led him to these really beautiful insights that also happened to be quite useful. They were useful for him, and I think they're useful for us. And then there are these other ideas that we're talking about that are powerful and compelling, but we're not so sure that they're entirely useful, although I think we're all agreeing that there's definitely some usefulness to them. Bret, I'm wondering where you see these ideas in the culture now. Most of us have not read much Foucault and Derrida, but are they having a big influence, do you think?
Yeah, I think they are. It's interesting because people can be really, really influenced by authors and ideas that they've never heard of. I think Foucault has been very influential, particularly in his way of conceiving of ideological systems as really just being the result of kind of power relations, power drives, the idea that basically the way you conceive a world is because of your own needs, your own particular position within a culture, your own desire to conceive the world in a particular way. So what's going on, for example, is that, let's see if I can pull off this example. There's a whole field called, fat studies, which is this field of thinking where they look for all of the ways in which the culture kind of unduly privileges the idea of, thinness and health, and kind of everything regarding weight is conceived of as kind of an ideological bias that's imposed by a cultural system that unduly privileges thinness over fatness. Now, as we've done with, I think, all the other themes in this conversation today, there's some truth there. There's definitely some ways in which we've put, feminine ideals of beauty of, 120 pound, 5'6" woman is just considered to be innately more beautiful. But everything is understood to be just a bias of the cultural system that it's a part of. Look at fat studies and it would say, well, it's really just a cultural bias that you don't find this 400-pound woman attractive.
This is just constructed, this notion that it's healthier to be normal weight. That's just a construction.
It's just a construction, and it's not a construction that's built on any foundation. That's the important part. Granted, it's a construction. It's not a construction on any foundation. The foundation, of course, doesn't have anything to do with the fact that, well, maybe, a woman in good health is more biologically, reproductive. She might reproduce, and, so that might make it reasonable for some people to be more attracted to her. Or, it might be that, people who are actually biologically healthier are more attractive in some sense. Now, that's really taboo if you're coming at it from a completely social constructionist point of view that I think someone like Foucault helped birth.
And in that argument, it divorces aesthetic from having any archetypal root.
Yeah. It divorces aesthetic, it divorces feeling, it divorces sensation.
And I'm thinking about the way that it might potentially be divorced from just fact. As we, and I think there actually is some controversy about. So let's say I'm aware that it's somewhat complicated, the picture between, say, excess weight and health. That it's maybe not as pernicious as we may have been led to believe, and yet I think there's also kind of overwhelming evidence that excess weight past a certain amount, is bad for all kinds of things. And I think there's just a lot of evidence about that, as I'm aware of, so that it sort of sweeps that off the table and says, this has all just been kind of manufactured through language, I guess, and we can manufacture a different reality with different language. Is that right?
Yes, and I think the word evidence is crucial here. If you go to someone like Jacques Derrida, he basically says there is no self-evidence. The idea of evidence itself is not admissible. Nothing is just self-evident. Once you make that move, then everything that the other person says is just a result of what? Their biases, their power drive, their particular placement within a cultural milieu.
You've also gotten rid of the possibility of ever finding sort of consensual truth, as it were. I mean, that you've removed that possibility.
Or if there's a consensus, who knows what it's based on? It could be an alliance
it's
just for the
suspect.
sake of convenience. It's suspect.
Right.
It's a hermeneutics of suspicion.
And again, it is right to question where these received truths come from. But I don't think it's helpful to say, and we can never find truth.
Jung talked a lot about the nothing but mentality.
Yes.
The kind of the reductive mentality. Now, you could say that, if you're saying that our ideals of beauty are nothing but prejudices based on, patriarchy or, a particular cultural lineage that we're a part of, the danger isn't in talking about the patriarchy or the cultural lineage or the history or all these other things. It's the saying nothing but that. That's the danger.
Or the kind of cultural punitive kind of punishments that are delivered if one does not comply with this redefining. So I'm imagining that it's a fine experiment to wonder if a word can be redefined to mean something else, and then for the culture then to be exposed to it And some people find, well, that's an interesting new definition, and I'll go along with that. It feels gratifying to me. And other people feeling that it doesn't seem to be tethered to their own sense of reality. But this feeling that the culture is going to police meanings of words and pressure this acceptance of new definitions, then people haven't gone through some kind of a liberation process. They're being compliant.
That's a great point.
Well, if none of us are really tethered to a sort of transcendent third, then it's really just your word against mine and what I want against what you want, If there's not something that we both feel responsible to, then you better use my constructs. You better use my definitions.
Or else you violate their subjectivity.
Yeah.
Which is, for us, so much of what analysis is, in a sense, violating someone's pain-causing subjectivity or their neurotic subjectivity, which also penetrates the neurotic isolation. So one of the costs of living in a world where language is totally subjective and self-defined is that you are all alone. It's an incredibly isolated place to be.
There's been a real interesting metamorphosis in our understanding of experience. And there's the phrase lived experience has really become widespread. But when I hear people talk about lived experience, what I'm hearing is something that feels so isolated. It sounds almost autistic. It's like there's this thing I have called lived experience, and it's all deep inside me, and I'm an authority on it, and you can't know anything about it other than what I tell you. Well, experience isn't that. Experience is something that really opens us up to the world, and it's also something that has an intersubjective aspect to it. But we're not using it that way anymore, and you really get the sense of such utter isolation.
In the last years of his life, Jung wrote The Undiscovered Self, which is this essay where he really looks at, and this would have been sort of mid-20th century that he was writing, looked at some of the political movements and the way that people were getting subsumed into these mass movements and kind of losing their individuality. And I think it's kind of touching into what you've both just been talking about is, who are you if you're not tethered to something transcendent? And he says, sort of the antidote for being kind of devoured by mass psychology or mass movements is to find your own grounding in your connection with the numinous. That is the essential thing that's required for individuality.
And if we were to extend that perhaps to linguistics, and I know you write about this, Bret, is to return words back to their kind of archetypal roots. And interestingly, I think you mentioned this in one part of the book, when letters themselves were derived from pictographs of objects. And words meant certain objects, which actually is still true in Hebrew, by the way. And then words became divorced from the objects that they represented and just became sounds that could be endlessly manipulated. But I love this idea that letters themselves and words did derive from a universal, and they carried an intrinsic understood meaning. And you give a wonderful quote from Hillman that I just love in your book, that words have the quality of being an emissary, a messenger. An envoy of the gods is described by Hillman as an angelic quality. There are angels in words, and a new angelology is required if we are to renew our faith in the communicative power of language. Without these angels in our words, and angel means originally emissary, a message bearer, how can we utter anything but personal opinions, things made up in our subjective minds? So I love this wonderful imaginative way that Hillman links this very ancient feeling of the numinous down into words. And of course, some languages still carry that. Hebrew still carries that. Every Hebrew letter is also a noun. The letter Aleph also means ox, and the letter Beth is a noun that means house. And they have numerical correlates, and when words are put together, they're strings of nouns as well as numerical equivalents, as well as having a cultural meaning subscribed to it. And so when a language is still connected to all of those correspondences, which you were mentioning earlier, it allows language and words to actually function on multiple levels simultaneously rather than be dissected and violated away from all of that.
Yeah. And I think there's something not only in our Western language, which doesn't have that sort of pictographic element to it that directly connects it with certain experiences or certain objects, that sort of dissociates us, but then also, and this is something that we've alluded to a little bit, there's something in the nature of our technology and the way in which we're using words online, and just really that dissociates our language from any sort of shared consensual reality too. It's so different if I'm talking with someone online and I'm debating something and we're not face to face and we're already debating abstractions. And then on top of that, we're not like literally in the same room with one another, and we don't have shared experiences together that we can refer back to. We can't say, oh, Joseph, that time when we were on a walk and I saw that little raccoon behind the tree. We don't have that shared frame of reference. So our words are becoming unusually detached even more than they already were. It's potentially dangerous territory,
And I find that very much an analysis, sometimes to my benefit. They'll say something like, I found it really alienating to go to this party and sit by myself. And I'll proceed along as if I know what the word alienation means. And then it'll occur to me like, wait a minute, what exactly do you mean when you say the word alienation? And then find that most people have a radically different agreement, or the idea is clothed in personal associations that are very different from what I might have thought. So I think this assumption that we know what somebody else is speaking is also called into question, perhaps rightly so sometimes.
Yeah. And if I was sitting next to a person who was saying that, I would also be picking up on their body language. I would be sensing things about them that I even can't sense on a Zoom conversation. And that would also subtly help inform my understanding of their meaning of that word. It's fascinating how our language is becoming ungrounded and untethered. How are we going to negotiate that?
Well, and language is the medium of relationship, right? So, I mean, that's how we know each other. That's how we communicate our inner life. I think our relationships, in some sense, are becoming ungrounded too, as you're pointing out, when they're all virtual.
Compare a debate. Let's say we had a heated debate and we're on two sides of a political spectrum and it's online, and then after the end of the debate we're not in agreement and we just cordially end the debate. That's one thing. What if we were in person, had that same debate, and at the end of the debate you gave me a warm hug that I really believed in?
Or that then we went and sat and broke bread together.
Yeah. It's gonna change so much of what I understand of what you have to say. It really is, I think.
And maybe that's a good place to switch to a dream. Hello, listeners. This is Lisa, and I wanted to let you know that my book, Motherhood, Facing and Finding Yourself, will be available this May from Sounds True Publishing. In my book, I take a deep dive into the psychological journey of motherhood using myths, personal stories, dreams, and of course, fairy tales. At my website, lisamarciano.com, you can read an excerpt from the book and learn more about me and my writing. You can also sign up for my free email course when you pre-order your copy. That's lisamarciano.com. Thanks, and I'll see you soon. Today's dreamer is a 29-year-old woman who is a psychotherapist. And here's the dream. There are tarantulas stuck on my skin the way ticks would be. They are big and hairy. Strangely, the tarantulas are hidden in small boxes which hang on my body. So their legs are digging into my skin, but I can't see them unless I remove the boxes. My mother is helping me to remove the spiders, but they keep coming back. They don't crawl upon me, but rather seem to be born from my skin. All of a sudden, my mother is gone, and I'm alone with some spiders still hanging on me. I can't remove them myself because I'm too scared to touch them. I am terrified and helpless. Here's the context. The tarantulas being stuck on me like ticks is a recurring dream. There are always different circumstances, but this keeps coming back. I have had these dreams for years, so I don't think explaining my context right now would be helpful. Just some background. I live alone. I don't have a partner. I have a complex relationship with my mother. I'm trying to get more distance from her. I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia 5 years ago, and living with chronic pain continues to be a difficult part of my life. Trying to love my body despite this is a big theme in my life. I love my job as a therapist, but I'm not able to work a lot because of my health. And the feelings in the dream were fear, helplessness, and loneliness. And she adds, I have a phobia of spiders, and tarantulas are by far the worst.
So if we just take the basic arc of the dream, that these tarantula legs are digging into her skin and the bodies of the tarantulas are allegedly in the boxes. The mother fails to help with this internal condition, and then the ego is left feeling helpless against whatever this curse is. So one of the difficulties in the dream is it doesn't really have a gratifying lysis, which is perhaps why she has the dream over and over and over again. We never kind of get to a satisfactory conclusion in the dream.
One of the things that really struck me was that as soon as the dreamer says that the tarantulas are born of my skin, at that point, the mother disappears. And I was also thinking about that in relation to her description. She says that she has a complex relationship with her mother, which I thought, okay, you have a mother complex. As soon as she acknowledges that the tarantulas are from her skin, then the mother disappears. I just found that an interesting connection.
Yeah, so there really are her tarantulas. They're really something within her that is asking to be met and dealt with. And she's looking to her mother to help her deal with it. But her mother, I don't know that her mother fails. It sounds like her mother removes them, but more keep coming. But she's looking to her mother to help her confront these contexts that are born from her very skin. The mother can't do that. I'm so struck by, when the mother disappears, I'm alone with the tarantulas and I can't remove them because I'm too scared to touch them. So it's really an image of kind of being paralyzed by fear of an unconscious content. But some content is pressing out and wanting to be acknowledged. And of course, we could spend a long time riffing on spiders, and tarantulas in particular. But one thing about spiders is they are an image of the mother.
The question I have is, what are those little boxes? What are the little boxes she keeps putting those tarantulas in? And it's not irrelevant that she's a therapist. What little boxes might a therapist put her tarantulas in? Questions.
Yeah, it does bring up this idea about sort of things are getting compartmentalized. I mean, the thing about the boxes is it doesn't make the tarantulas go away, it just hides them. So in some sense, that might be an image of a defense. Mm-hmm. I'm just not going to look at this.
She shared that she has fibromyalgia.
That's what I was thinking, yeah.
And those tarantulas, to me, speak to that. Born out right out of her skin, they keep erupting They're painful. It must be painful to have tarantulas being born right out of your skin. That's never happened to me. I've never had fibromyalgia, but intuitively they sort of feel similar.
Well, and they're clinging to her like ticks. So they're born out of her skin almost, and they're also, we can assume, feeding off of her.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least maybe that's the fear that she has, that they're feeding off of her. I mean, fibromyalgia seems to me like one of those conditions that is very psychoidal, that says something about the relationship between psyche and soma, that carries with it perhaps a metaphorical communication. And I'm not trying to say it's all in people's heads. That's not what I'm saying. But I think that many physical states, that our bodies are constantly talking to us. I'll just put it like that. So if that's true, then what is trying to get expressed here? What's trying to come out?
Well, that raises a question for me. You said that the spiders are often associated with the mother and the devouring aspect of the mother. And I don't doubt that that's true. I think that is. But my question is why? Why that association?
I'm taking a different direction with this. If we imagine that the ego is the least reliable interpreter within the dream, she says, they don't crawl upon me, but rather seem to be born from my skin. She's not saying that she's watching them come out of her skin. She's making a kind of assumption. So if I step back and I imagine that she has a very complicated relation with her mother, and when I'm with the mother, it feels like things are crawling at me, crawling around me and hurting me. And even when the mother leaves the room, the image of the mother leaves the room, I still have this feeling going on inside of me, and I'm attributing it to myself. And isn't that what children do all the time? That when a child is in a difficult relationship with a parent, it never occurs to them that the parent is the problem. They always internalize it and assume something must be wrong with me, that I'm not in good relationship to the mother or good relationship to the father. So I'm wondering if the spiders in the boxes represent a kind of reaction to the presence of the mother and a reaction to the mother complex, and she's not looking in the right place for the solution.
Because she's looking to fix the spiders? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, she thinks something's wrong with her. She's imagining that she is the place from which the spiders are emerging. And I think that the spiders are some form of instinctive response to the presence of the mother, which is really interesting if it's related to the fibromyalgia. Is the fibromyalgia some kind of a reaction to the tension with the mother and some kind of an unacceptable piece of information that she cannot put her hands on or is terrified and feels helpless against?
So just moving a little step beyond this, I'm thinking about the fact that spiders stupefy their victims. And, you've maybe seen this if you're watching a spider's web. A bug gets caught in the web and the spider rushes into the middle and bites it and then begins wrapping it immediately. And I'm fairly certain the spider doesn't kill its prey because it actually wants to eat it alive, but it stupefies it. It kind of puts it to sleep. And there can be a way that can be an action of a certain kind of mother complex, that it stupefies us, that it puts us to sleep, that it renders us incapable of or paralyzed in terms of addressing our own problems. And I wonder if that's a little bit the quality of the mother complex here, because when the mother leaves, she's helpless. She can't do anything. And it makes me think that somehow there may be an enmeshed relationship here with the mother, and that somehow her relationship with her inner world is overly mediated by either the personal mother or the mother complex, that she can't even get her hands on her own tarantulas because that role has been so fully ceded to the mother.
So the personal mother standing between the dreamer and her relationship to the archetypal mother would be an interesting way of thinking of it.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering about. And so she's rendered absolutely helpless in the face of her own unconscious. And even in her relationship to her body. And it is true that the personal mother usually mediates those things. The mother in the life of the child mediates the relationship between the child and the child's unconscious and the child's body. Who is it? Is it Winnicott who said that the mother introduces the baby to its body? I think that's Winnicott.
Mm-hmm.
So that process can go awry if the mother is too intrusive or devouring. So I'm making up a little fantasy here. I have no idea if any of this really relates to this dreamer, but
no, but it's an interesting idea that the spiders could represent some kind of eruptive, even psychotic content that has been there for a long time, that the mother could have, should have mediated in some fashion and was unsuccessful about that because of some inadequacy in the relationship, perhaps even in early infancy. I think that that's a fair piece, but now as an adult, she's still left with having to negotiate this unconscious content, as you said, Lisa.
Well, and I don't even know that it has to be a psychotic content, just any kind of unconscious content that she feels she can't have a direct relationship with. But because she can't have her own relationship with it, and it needs to be constantly mediated by the mother, then it looks dangerous and so frightening that it's actually paralyzing.
Well, but when I look at that last sentence, that's like the definition of psychotic anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, and I mean, we use the word psychotic in a way that's actually not anywhere near as devastating as the culture uses it. We're talking about just unconscious content that erupts upward and that's not being mediated correctly.
Yeah.
Two things that seem important to me is that this is a very recurrent dream, and she's had a phobia regarding spiders for a long time.
What do you make of that?
I don't know. I'm really humbled by dream interpretation. I don't know exactly what to make of it, other than this is obviously a long-standing issue. It's something that hasn't been resolved. It's something that I assume is going to keep coming back until it is.
Well, and spiders are quite archetypal. And, we could dig further into that. These are specifically tarantulas, and I don't know, that seems important as well. Mm-hmm. But this is kind of a really primordial image. And it makes sense, by the way, that a lot of people are phobic of spiders, and that's a very sensible thing because some spiders can be quite dangerous. So I don't think that's just, I think there's some biology there too.
I also want to step back a little bit. I'm not even sure that there are spiders in the dream. Really look at the image. All she sees are boxes on her body. And then she just assumes that there are spiders inside of the boxes that are digging into her skin. But she doesn't see that.
I don't know, though. I don't know, Joseph, because she says they are big and hairy.
Exactly. Strangely, the tarantulas are hidden in small boxes which hang on my body. So their legs are digging in my skin, but I cannot see them unless she removes the boxes. So it actually looks more like there's a box missing, a panel, and it's sitting on her body, and the things are actually moving around inside of the box. So there's an assumption that what this is about is the tarantula, which I think leads into her phobia about tarantulas, that there's something crawling around in her, and it's landed on the idea of the spider. But actually in the dream world, it's just an assumption that it's a spider, but something is in the box. And it's unclear about what she sees if a box is removed. There's a mystery here that isn't totally clear, at least in the way that she's describing the dream.
I'm also thinking about the what I read from the Dictionary of Symbols, talking about how spiders are the great weavers of fate, and wondering, you just said that great thing, Joseph, there's something crawling around inside her, and the psyche has landed on the image of the spider for this. And is this someone who is afraid of confronting her own fate? Is that part of where the phobia comes from?
And people can react horrifyingly to their fate. And coming back to even what we were talking about earlier in our conversation, is something immutable pressing on her. There is a demand that is unyielding, which then, of course, demands that the ego relativize to something that is greater than itself. So something is not crawling on her skin. Something is emerging from her skin. It is covered by a box. And she assumes it's a spider that the mother has to remove, or the mother thinks it has to be removed, which is another kind of thing to consider.
You know, what I think I would want to say to this dreamer is the spider is an image of great archetypal power. And you might want to come and meet your spider by doing a little research on the imagery of spiders and take a look at the importance of spiders in myths and fairy tales. See if you can come into relationship with this sort of transcendent power that is captured in that image.
And I would say, to her a little bit on a different angle, is that you've had this dream many times and you believe it's about the spider, and your phobia tells you it's about the spider. But I think that's a kind of neurotic suffering, that there is something, if we push the spider aside, there is something else that doesn't look like a spider that needs your attention, that in fact will induce more suffering than the creepiness of the spider. So underneath the terrified helplessness, which often can be a reaction, a defense against an emerging reality in the psyche, there is something else. And I'm going to suspect that it's rage.
Mm-hmm.
The unacceptable, murderous rage towards the mother. It's a totally intuitive hit, but that would be my guess.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.